Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, A New Approach to Evaluate Outcomes of Complex Care Randomized Controlled Trials, the Distillation Method. My name is Emma Optop. I'm a communications officer at the Center for Healthcare Strategies. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly go over a few logistics. So to eliminate background noise, audio lines are muted during today's event. There will be a moderated Q&A session during today's presentation. You may submit a question anytime by clicking the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen, and instructions are shown on the screen at this time. The slides and recording will be available after the webinar at the link in the chat that we'll be sharing shortly. And a brief online evaluation will also pop up on your screen following today's event. So if you could complete that, that would mean a lot to us. Your feedback is really important to us. Next slide, please. And I'm going to just quickly start off by providing a brief overview of the Better Care Playbook. So the Playbook is an online resource center for evidence-based and promising practices to improve care for people with complex health and social needs. It is coordinated by the Center for Healthcare Strategies through support from 7 leading healthcare foundations: Arnold Ventures, the Commonwealth Fund, the John A. Hartford Foundation, the Milbank Memorial Fund, Peterson Center on Healthcare, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Miscan Foundation, and we appreciate their support. On the Playbook, you'll find summaries of peer-reviewed articles, briefs and reports, and implementation tools, as well as original case studies and webinars of promising complex care programs and strategies to help providers, payers, and community-based organizations and policymakers move evidence to action. Given the many challenges in developing and interpreting research on complex care, the Playbook includes resources to support stakeholders in designing complex care research and understanding the results, including the resources that will be shared today. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief overview of our agenda. Our first presenters will be providing an overview of the distillation method and applied case studies to equip researchers, evaluators, and program leaders in complex care to more effectively interpret results from past randomized controlled trials and also to improve the design of future RCTs. We will end with a moderated Q&A session where webinar attendees can ask our panelists questions. Next slide, please. We're thrilled to welcome all of our presenters today. So first up, we'll be hearing from Dr. Anna Davis and Dr. John Adams from Kaiser Permanente on the challenges associated with randomized controlled trials in complex care and how the distillation method can potentially relieve some of those challenges. And they will also be going over a case example. And then we will hear from Dr. Don Wiest and Dr. Chung Yang at the Camden Coalition of Healthcare Providers, who will share how they are applying the distillation method to Camden's hotspotting trial from a few years back. And my colleague Logan Kelly from CHCS will be moderating the Q&A session at the end. And with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Anna and John.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a pleasure to be here. John and I are thrilled to be here today to talk about the distillation method, which was published in the HSR journal this past summer. We'd like to acknowledge the study team and of course to thank the Commonwealth Fund for supporting this work. And thank you also to the Playbook team for inviting us to speak here today. RCTs are the gold standard for causal inference, and there is appreciation in the complex care field of the value of randomized designs for the rigorous evaluation of intervention. RCTs allow causal inference about the effect of an intervention because the random assignment enables the experimenter to have equivalence between the treatment and control condition. The magic of randomization is that it balances the groups both on observable characteristics like age or gender and on unobservable features like motivation, which cannot be adjusted for using covariates or other variable-driven methods. These features of randomization, statistical equivalence, and exogenous treatment assignment mean that RCTs are a very powerful analysis design. And the primary strategy for analyzing randomized trial data is the intent to treat. In an intent to treat analysis, we say that once randomized, always analyzed. In other words, all participants are analyzed in the group to which they were assigned. The intent to treat approach is important because it protects the unbiasedness that is granted by the randomization. It's important to note that RCTs are not infallible, and there are situations where an RCT is not the best choice for feasibility or ethical reasons, or because such a high level of evidence is not necessary for the given purpose at hand. But RCTs do address many of the sources of potential bias that undermine other common evaluation designs that we see in the complex care field and more broadly, including pre-post comparisons or propensity scored approaches. There's a practical problem in the complex care world and for other care model RCTs that makes RCTs potentially underpowered. Care model RCTs are unlike pharma trials or laboratory trials because they can't always take advantage of strategies that are typically seen in those fields. These would be things like delivering the treatment immediately after the randomization is completed, or offering very simple treatment protocols like a pill a day sort of intervention. Often complex care trials involve multi-component analyses or interventions, pardon me, that are delivered over weeks or months. And these designs often experience issues in achieving complete participant responsiveness. This would look like incomplete uptake or engagement, inability to deliver the full dose of the intervention, or other gaps in implementation fidelity. When trials can't use those power increasing tricks that we see in pharma trials, it's common that the result will be an underpowered RCT. Now, RCT planners can correctly account for likely under or low responsiveness during statistical power calculations a priori, but it's often true that responsiveness is lower than anticipated, and as such, those power calculations may have been inadequate. When a trial is underpowered, interpreting null results is not straightforward. It's very unclear whether the intervention itself failed or if the evaluation of the intervention failed. In school, we learn that we should never accept the null hypothesis, but sometimes we behave as though we're doing exactly that. When an underpowered trial returns a null result, we abandon the intervention as ineffective, when it may be that we simply didn't give it an adequate chance to be evaluated fairly.
So this is the basic picture. At randomization, we have the subjects randomized to the control group on the left and the treatment group on the right. Ideally, they would all be around on analysis day, and they would, and the treatment group, everyone would get the treatment in its full dosage. But things happen, right? And more things happen in complex care trials than happen in traditional pharma trials where this model is taken from. So oftentimes we do recruitment after randomization in these trials because, you know, it saves the expense of recruiting people that are going to interact with people that are going to say no. But also, if you're doing a trial where you're using, you know, available administrative data, you can often do this without doing a pre-assessment of people. And you can see here, as we move left to right, we did a design power of 80%, but we lost in recruitment a bunch of people. We came down to 63%. And then a while later, we go back for enrollment, and we're going to lose some people. They'll have changed their mind. They'll have changed circumstances, and they won't actually participate. And you can see the drop there now from 63% power to 29% power. And then finally, We don't always succeed in delivering the intervention to everyone. Can't get them on the phone, can't get them to come in, and so forth. At this point, the power has fallen to 11%. And this interacts in an unattractive way with the classical analyze them as you randomize them ITT estimate, because we're down to the point where the people in the treatment group for ITT mostly did not actually get the treatment. And that's a tremendous power shot to take. So the distillation method, which we've cooked up by thinking about the disconnects between the classical perfect trial and the realities of the pragmatic nature of complex care trials, is we kind of capitalize on the observation that people are different, and that their enrollment probability may be correlated with their perceived benefit, or the person recruiting them thinks it's going to be good for them and is going to push harder to work out the impediments to delivering it to them. So there's going to be a relationship between who enrolls and who participates and what their likely benefit is. So we try to refocus the analysis on a new eligibility criteria. We try to cut through the original RCT and pull out a smaller RCT where people are more likely to enroll and they'll have a higher average treatment effect. And under the right conditions, you can win by reducing the size of your trial, and you win by getting people that have higher average treatment effects with that trial. And that's a win in a bunch of dimensions, right? It gives you the power back that you lost from not being able to recruit successfully or enroll successfully, but it also gives you some insight into who benefits most from your intervention. So the distillation method is a three-stage approach. The first thing you do is you build a predictive model for participation in the intervention. So this is, you've done your intervention, you've done your implementation, and you're at the end of the process ready for analysis. So you build a model for who in the treatment arm did take the intervention or did ultimately show up. We do that with a machine learner using only baseline predictors, and we only do this modeling inside the treatment arm. So a lot like propensity scores, you're not looking at outcomes, so you're sort of protected from p-hacking or data dredging. We then use the predicted probability of enrollment to recut the population by throwing out people who have the characteristics in general of people who do not ultimately participate. So we subset both the intervention control groups in the same way, using only information that was available at randomization and not looking at their outcomes. And then in the third stage, we reanalyze the intervention with these subsets of the data, and you can sort of tune the amount of distillation. And as this came up in some of the prior questions, this is actually a pretty simple process. This is no more technically difficult than, say, the stratified approach to propensity score methods. If the machine learning is awkward or difficult, you can do logistic regression, right? This can be done with very ordinary tools in SAS, Stata, R. It can almost be done in Excel, but we don't recommend it. So why does this thing work? Well, if you're going to get more out of something statistically than the classical approach, then usually it comes from having to assume something. And our assumptions are there's a positive correlation between treatment uptake and the treatment effect, and we must be able to predict that treatment uptake with something. Now we're lucky a lot of times in administrative data, we might have a lot of tools to use to make that prediction. And then note that we only advocate this for RCT data, where we're trying to hang on to the positive benefits of randomization. And I should also note that when you first look at this, it often looks a lot like the instrumental variables approach, the propensity score approach to program evaluation. It isn't either of those. It's a two equation system. A lot of the tools are the same to develop the model, but it has different assumptions and it estimates a different thing.
All right, excellent. So I'll now present a case study that we completed using the distillation method and an RCT that was carried out within Kaiser Permanente in 2015 and 2016. This was an example of a program that used a complex case management model to serve patients who were predicted to have high costs in the coming year. The program was initially randomized with 805 participants, around 400 in each arm. And in the design that John described, the program recruited patients after the randomization was complete because of the use of this administrative control group who received usual care. The dilution that took place in this particular trial was pretty strong, with about 65% of enrollees agreeing to enroll in the intervention. And we defined participation for the case study with this simple dichotomous choice to enroll or not enroll. I'll note that there is more complexity to dilution within this intervention. The average duration of enrollment for patients who did enroll ranged from 6 days to a little more than a year, and on average was almost 5 months. So broad variability in the duration of enrollment. And of course, we could have looked at the content of intervention delivery in other ways as well. But for the purpose of this case study, we defined dilution as the enrollment decision itself. In the original trial, with an intent to treat analysis, the evaluation focused on costs and utilization of inpatient, outpatient, and emergency department visits in the following year. For the case study, in the same 3 stages that John described, we started by predicting that enrollment decision. We used GBM in R, and the model achieved a predictive accuracy measured by AUC, or area under the curve, of 0.88. The covariates that we used in this model were wide-ranging. We were lucky to be in an environment with a broad array of data available about both intervention and control participants. From the baseline period, we used measures of demographics, census-linked data on income and education, clinical values like lab data or vital signs, comorbidities, prior year utilization and costs, and risk scores such as the DXCG actuarial model. Really, covariates in the stage 1 could be anything that you have in an equivalent manner for the intervention and control group from the baseline period. I'll also note that for this application, we're not overly concerned about interpretability of the stage 1 prediction. And so we don't worry too much about sort of the logical framework for the choice of predictors. Also, GBM is designed in a way that we don't need to worry too much about multicollinearity amongst the predictors. In the distillation step of the analysis, we use the predicted probabilities of enrollment to distill the population to 4 increasing levels of concentration. As we move from 100% of enrollees to, or participants, to 80, 60, 40, and 20, the total sample size for analysis decreased, and those who remained were more concentrated with patients who ultimately had agreed to enroll in the intervention. But note that with this distillation process, we necessarily throw out some patients who were actually treated throughout of the analysis, along with those who were untreated, because the distillation relies on the predicted probability of enrollment rather than actual enrollment. And finally, We reanalyzed the intervention, focusing on the same outcomes and standard methods for the variables in question. So let me read in how we look at the results. We've looked at 2 time periods for each of the outcomes, a first year compared to the baseline and a second year compared to the baseline. The first result in each of these charts is the intent to treat estimate with 100% of the population included as randomized. And as we move from left to right on the x-axis, the distillation increases and the population is enriched with takers. As you see, moving left to right, the confidence bands get wider. This is expected because of the reduction in sample size. The dotted line at 0 is the null. And when the confidence band crosses the null, the estimate is not significant statistically. We show statistical significance with filled dots. So you can see for outpatient utilization, we found in period 1 at moderate levels of distillation, a significant increase in number of ambulatory visits. And in period 2, at all levels of distillation, a significant decrease. For emergency department visits, well, the intent to treat estimate was null in the first follow-up period. At moderate levels of distillation, we do find a significant decrease in number of emergency department visits, and this carries into period 2. For inpatient admissions, we found no significant effects in either time period. Although you can see a directional trend toward more hospitalizations in the first period as the distillation level increases. And for total costs of care, well, we don't find any significant effect in the first period. In the second period, we do find greater savings or more change in total cost of care as distillation increases.
Okay, so I'm gonna a little squeeze for time here, so I'll go kind of quickly. This does show how the distillation method can increase power by focusing on participants who are more likely to be responsive. And anytime there's heterogeneity in uptake, there's some possibility this will work. It will not always work, of course. It's entirely possible that the distillation effect will not be able to defeat the reduction in sample size. Now you can plan for this proactively as a complementary analysis, especially when you're not confident in your eligibility criteria. But we think it can also be used post hoc to salvage file drawer studies that may have had some merit, but the simple intent to treat analysis was not deep enough in its examination. And then there are extensions we're working on. I think, Camden will be we're talking about one of them, but you can change your definition of what it means to get the intervention. You can have a minimum amount of contact, for example. And that's okay. That's something that's sort of under the influence of the people in the study. But because we predict with pre-randomization covariates and cut treatment and control the same way, you can experiment with those kinds of definitions. And there are, some other ideas. There's a triage idea here that you might want to trim at the other end of the scale because you've got people who are uptakers but are refractory to treatment. So we continue to work on ways to make this more usable. And you can contact us with any questions, and pretty soon we'll be able to send out the code. And back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John and Anna. Really appreciate it. I'd now like to turn the webinar over to Dawn and Chung from the Camden Coalition, who will share a little bit about how they applied the method to their work.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Emma, and to the rest of the Playbook team, and also to Anna and John. And hello, everybody. So many of you are familiar with the Camden Coalition and our signature care management intervention, the Camden core model. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving a general overview of the core model and then describe the hotspotting RCT of the core model and our interest in applying the distillation method to that data. I'm then going to hand it over to my colleague Chang to discuss preliminary results from our application of the method. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as part of a coalition of hospitals, healthcare and social service providers, and community representatives, we used shared data and clinical observation to develop and launch the Camden core model in 2007. At the time and continuing since then, we were motivated by the observation that the highest need patients had the most frequent emergency department use and hospital admissions, and that the drivers of frequent and often avoidable hospital use were not being successfully addressed despite an abundance of touch points with the healthcare system. Our aim from the beginning has been to understand the needs, strengths, and the goals of the individuals with complex health and social needs that we work with, support them as they strive to achieve their health-related goals, and facilitate robust connections between them and providers and resources within the community. Over the years, we've deepened our focus on ecosystems of care so that communities can more effectively address the systemic drivers of poor health. And through this work, we aim to transform health and social service systems so that every individual receives person-centered care and that this care is rooted in authentic healing relationships. Next slide, please. So the core model has gone through many changes over the years based on what we've learned about the lives, needs, and interests of our intervention participants and the limitations of the systems with which they interact. So for example, the composition of our interdisciplinary care teams have changed over time, and we've added additional elements to the model, including housing first and a medical legal partnership. So what did the core model look like in practice during the randomized control trial? So it began with real-time patient identification using our health information exchange. Our triage team used these data to identify individuals admitted to the hospital and supplemented their review with electronic medical records from 2 local hospital systems to further identify individuals who could benefit from an intensive care management approach. We enrolled people with 2 or more hospital admissions in the 6 months prior to intervention enrollment, who had 2 or more chronic conditions, and who had additional barriers to health and well-being, which could include polypharmacy, lack of social support, mobility challenges, language barriers, a mental health condition, or a substance use disorder. A team met eligible individuals at bedside in one of the 2 participating hospitals to invite them to join in the study. And for those who consented and were randomized into the treatment arm of the trial, care planning often began at the hospital bedside, and then engagement continued in the community once the individual was discharged. Intervention milestones included meeting the individual in the community within 5 days of hospital discharge, connecting them to primary or specialty care within 7 days, and working with them until they were medically stabilized and making strides towards achieving their own goals. The community-based team typically consisted of a registered nurse or a licensed practical nurse and a community health worker with support from a clinical psychologist, social workers, and health coaches, depending on patient needs. Care teams worked with individuals in the community for an average of 180 days. Next slide, please. So we partnered with MIT's Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab, commonly known as JPAL, to design and run the trial and began randomizing patients in June of 2014 at the hospital bedside after they had consented to participate in the study. During this trial, individuals randomized into the control group had no contact from the Camden Coalition care team and received the standard of care within the community. By the time the trial ended in September 2017, 800 individuals had been enrolled, and they were mostly equally divided between intervention and control groups. The results from the trial were published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2020. Now, the primary outcome tested was the 180-day readmission rate, and results showed no impact of the core model. Both control and intervention groups had a roughly 62% readmission rate at 6 months post-enrollment. We did find a small but significantly higher rate of SNAP participation among intervention patients. That was around 9%. Next slide, please. So there are two aspects of the RCT that led us to believe that the distillation method was a good fit for our data. First, our triage criteria resulted in a highly diverse study population, and the RCT protocol did not pre-specify analyses that might have been important for understanding the potential impact of the core model for defined subgroups of patients. The information on this slide offers a glimpse of the level of heterogeneity in the data. We thought it possible that there would be variation in intervention participation and readmission outcomes based on subgroup status. For example, individuals experiencing housing instability, advanced chronic illness, or a serious mental health related comorbidity could conceivably have different rates, not only in terms of their engagement in the intervention, but also related to the readmission outcomes compared to others. Next slide, please. Thank you. Second, the level of participation in the intervention was highly various, and we have seen correlations in the data between number of engagement hours and readmissions, again, making the data highly appropriate for the distillation method. As for the milestones I mentioned earlier, just over 1/2 of intervention group patients had a home visit from care team staff within 5 days of hospital discharge, and only 36% had a primary care or specialist visit within 7 days. Also, the number of engagement hours during the first week of the intervention varied dramatically, with an average of around 3 hours and ranging from literally 0 to around 15, as you can see in the histogram here. So I'll turn it now over to Chang to discuss our application of the distillation method to these data.
Yeah, thank you, Don. So in many programs, including our intervention program, so the randomization sometimes happened after the patient consented to the program participation. In other words, the dilution of treatment usually happens on at the intervention delivery stage. So then when the distillation method is applied to our program evaluation, one of the main parts that we need to address is who is considered as participant and who is considered as non-participant. So in practice, this is usually very difficult because we actually don't have a clear definition of participation. Because almost every intervention person may receive something in the program. However, that something may not be sufficient for the treatment. So that means we need to find a threshold for that something or the definition of participation. So approach this by thinking about what components comprised the participation. The first thing that came into our mind is the number of staff hours that a patient received during the early stage. So we consider an early stage because this is the crucial stage of our intervention program as we work intensively with the patients. So we do the data collection, the home visits, we also do the relationship building. So this is very crucial in our intervention. However, realized this dimension may not be enough because some person may receive a lot of hours at the beginning, but then just lost to follow up. So we hope the treatment is also continuous over the whole course of intervention. So next dimension we look at is the intervention consistency, defined as a number of weeks with successful intervention encounters during the early stage. The last thing that we consider here is the intervention outcome or the outcome timing. So we labeled the outcome when the patient finished the program. So we hope that the patient could stay in the program up to some time threshold, for example, 1/3 of the average intervention period, because with that, we think all the patients received sufficient treatment during the intervention. So with these 3 dimensions, we finally came to the final definition for participation. which is patients were considered as participants if they met at least 2 of the following conditions. Like the intervention arm was greater than 3 plus, they received a successful 4 weeks out of the initial 6 weeks, and the patient should go through the intervention up to 60 days. So with this criteria, we found that 76% of our patients in the intervention arm were considered as participants. After deciding the participation label, we followed the distillation method that John and Anna just described. So it involves 3 stages. The first stage is to estimate the participation in the intervention arm. So we've used the same classification method called the gradient boost machine model, GBM. The area under the curve we achieved is about 0.8. So the variables that we used to predict this participation label were all baseline variables, indicating the patient's status before the program, before the start of the program. So for example, we have the demographic variables, including age, gender, race, and ethnicity, the social variables, like including education level, the housing status, and the past arrest history. And also we have some clinical variables, including the single physical disease indicator. For example, whether the patient has diabetes, whether the patient has chronic heart failure. We also consider the behavioral diagnosis, like mental health and substance abuse indicators, as well as the patient's past hospitalizations. So this is actually the output coming from the first stage model. Here, the figure shows the relative frequency, relative influence for this variable. So basically, this is a relative measure, which means the value itself is not meaningful, just which one is the first, which one is the second makes sense here. So we see that the age, the natural stay at the index admission, the past hospitalizations, like housing status, are the main variables that separate participants and non-participants. However, this relative influence doesn't tell us the direction of each variable, each covariate, like whether when the age increases, whether the participation has the probability of participation is increased or decreased, we cannot see from this. So the way that we determine the change in patient characteristics is in this stage, the second stage, the subpopulation selection. So after stage 1, each person in the whole population was assigned the estimated probability of participation. Then we select the X% of the whole population, including both intervention and the control, with the largest probability of participation. So this X can range from 100, which means the whole population, to some lower number like 20% of the population. So we see that as the X decreases, it means the sample contains individuals with a larger probability of participation. In other words, the sample is now more participant concentrated. Or in other words, the sample has a higher proportion of a participant. So as we move X from the 100 to some lower number, the sample is more participant concentrated, has a higher proportion of participants. We see that people with kidney disease, COPD, like less than high school education are more common in the participants. Whereas having been arrested, 3+ hospitalization in the past 6 months, and unstable housing are less common in these samples. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Chang. First, I want to say that we do have preliminary results from stage 3 modeling, in which we compare readmission outcomes among patients in the intervention and control arms of the trial as samples are increasingly distilled These results are promising, and we will report the findings in a manuscript we're preparing currently for submission to a peer-reviewed journal. Now, we found the stage 2 modeling results fascinating as we saw these changes in the population as we drilled down to the smaller samples of people with higher probabilities of intervention participation. These findings are leading us to refine our triage and data collection processes. For example, routinizing collection of social needs data so that care teams have a fuller picture of the individual's circumstances when they entered the intervention. We learned that because of life circumstances or other characteristics, some individuals may be more difficult to engage in the early days of the intervention. And this has led us to think through different engagement strategies. For example, ensuring that our care teams have up-to-date criminal justice information for individuals with an arrest history and are able to quickly identify intervention participants who may be incarcerated and then can arrange to follow up with them in the county jail instead of letting such a long time pass until they know where they can reach the person who's enrolled. So thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dawn and Chung. I'd like to invite all of the presenters to come on screen now as we begin to answer some of the questions that we've received from participants so far. If you hadn't had a chance to ask your question yet, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom to share that question, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. And I'll just note that we will be kind of eager to see the results of the work that Dawn just mentioned at the end there, and we'll certainly plan to share any publications on the playbook as well. So first, I'd like to just ask for, we received a question about what are the kind of staff areas of expertise that organizations need to have in place to apply the distillation method, and also a question kind of asking about how organizations that may not have as much in-house capacity to do this kind of work, what are opportunities that they can have to partner with other institutions? So I'll turn it over to Dawn to speak to this question first.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And so Camden Coalition is a small nonprofit organization in Camden. We do have data scientists and data analysts on staff that have been very instrumental in us being able to apply some of these techniques. However, I would say that in other organizations that don't have individuals at that level of experience and skill, there are probably opportunities all around you in your local universities, for example, academic researchers who have a hunger to really dig into these sorts of questions and apply new methods. We've partnered successfully, as I mentioned during the presentation, for example, with JPAL. That was a great partnership, partnering with Anna and John now, who are academic researchers. We have other projects, people reach out to us. We reach out to other academics. So my point is that, yes, it can be intimidating in some ways, but as John said, this method in particular, does take a certain level of expertise and skill, but at the same time, if you don't have those sorts of individuals and those sorts of resources in your organization, there are opportunities around you to reach out to.
Yeah, I'd chime in a little on how hard it is or isn't hard. It's about the difficulty of something like the Twang package in R, which I've noticed a lot of undergraduate kids are learning in their basic stat classes nowadays. So it's not like, some of the competing methods from econometrics, like local average treatment effect or complier average causal effect, where you really have to be pretty good with the math stat to understand what's going on. The other thing about this method, it's designed to be bulletproof, right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help make a tool that people can use. The other thing about it that's nice is when it fails benignly. So if you don't do a great job with stage 1, you'll just be back to where you started. But it's not going to kick out some wacky false discovery. It's just not constructed that way. So, everything's a little odd when you first look at it, right? But I think this one, if you, look at the paper, maybe get some coaching, I think most good secondary data analysts will be able to master the method without too much trouble.
Great, thank you so much. And we just received a question asking, have you considered and mitigated for how this method may be introducing bias into the results, such as by excluding patients of marginalized communities who may be less trusting of the health system and less likely to engage. Anna and John, I'll see if you'd like to answer this one first, and Don and Chung would invite you to respond as well.
Yeah. Well, I think, the whole algorithmic justice disparities thing is a potential problem here, as it is anywhere. So the extreme case would be, what if race was a good predictor of enrollment? Would you want to cut out historically disadvantaged groups from your eligibility criteria? Given that you wouldn't do that in a real implementation downstream, right? So clearly not. And you'd want to, but you'd want to, Dawn, I think, hit on this really well. The stage 2 model has information in its own right. So what you would want to do is say, well, why? Why did that happen? And what's the action I can take to make it not happen in my next trial of the method? And the tricky part is the things that are correlated with things like that. So, the race variable, it's obvious. The ethical issues are transparent. But when something's correlated with something that you should not be using to define eligibility criteria from a fairness point of view, that's when it gets more subtle, and you have to think about it as you would with any algorithmic targeting method. Nothing special here about that. It's a problem everywhere.
Great, thanks so much, John. And Don, would you like to speak to that as well?
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I agree 100% with John. I mean, the beauty of this method, especially that phase 2, is that it gives you, as he said, this incredibly important information about who's engaging, who's less or more engaged, et cetera. And as I mentioned during our part of the presentation, this has led us to think about different engagement strategies and to try to deeply understand what's happening, like why is it, and how can we address those barriers to participation.
And then we received another question, and I think this one would go to Don and Chung, asking about whether readmission rates were stratified by diagnosis. And someone saying that they typically stratify based on the cause or reason for admission, and asking if they're introducing bias in that.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? You mean the readmission rates are stratified by diagnosis?
Yeah, so they're asking if it's introducing bias to kind of stratify based on the cause or reason for admission, and asking if you were stratifying by diagnosis in calculating readmission rates.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because currently we are, for the outcomes, like readmission outcomes, we are not distinguishing about the reasons for the readmission, like what kind of diagnoses are for this readmission. We are not distinguishing that. However, we do use diagnosis to kind of determine the patient's health status. For example, we use a diagnosis to determine whether the patient has diabetes, whether the patient has chronic heart failure, and also the mental health and the substance abuse. So in other words, we do use diagnosis to determine a patient's status before the start of the program. But for the readmission outcomes, yeah, we don't distinguish. It's all type of readmissions.
I think I'd chime in that, we have an unfortunate situation that bias has a technical meaning and it also has a colloquial meaning. And especially in the colloquial sense, it's a complex thing with a meaning that's subtly different depending on the situation. So statistical bias, you can't do much to introduce bias because you don't look at the outcome variable when you do the stage 1 modeling. And that's the same as propensity score logic. It's no different than that argument. But bias in the colloquial sense, I'd refer you to my previous answer. There's obvious bias if you start to use race variables to determine eligibility criteria. And then there's this gray zone in between where it may be something that's correlated with race or correlated with some latent construct that you really shouldn't be using to target or not target benefits. And it's that middle category that's the particularly challenging one.
And then another question asked if any, and I think this one again is for Don and Chung, if any research was done on the excluded sample, and are there any interesting or actionable findings that that you're able to share at this time?
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was going to say that's a great question. And we have been, it has been suggested before that we do an analysis of the excluded population. And I really appreciate the point that there could be a lot learned from that type of analysis. If we have done it, we can't share at this point any of the results from that. But I don't think that we have done it yet, but we're planning to.
And I'll chime in to say, we believe there's a lot of promise in that sort of inquiry. In the example of the case study that we presented, our intent, this was a long retired intervention, and we capitalized on the historical data that were available from it. So we didn't have any intent to necessarily produce actionable learnings for the care delivery system out of that particular case study. That being said, we do think there's a lot of potential value and useful information to be learned from that sort of inquiry.
Great, thanks all so much. And then we received a question from a state Medicaid leader who's asking how to translate the importance of this method and the findings to a state and federal policymaker audience, and thinking about how this could inform policy decisions. So Anna, I'll pass this one to you first.
Sure, that's a great question, and one that we've thought some about. Absolutely, we would advocate for, thoughtful interrogation of null results. It is tempting sometimes when a study is null to file it away and move on. And I think through this process of developing this approach, we've really come to have an increased appreciation for the complexity of interpreting null findings and the potential nuance in understanding what about the trial itself deviated from the planned protocol, to what extent participant responsiveness was adequate, intervention dose, and all other aspects of design, such as the choice of outcome measures and the follow-up time. Thinking carefully about all those things, I think, is important for any policymaker who's reacting to evidence. Null evidence may mean that a really promising idea should be retrialed. That's a big ask. Trials are expensive and take a lot of time. And so possibly a better strategy is to be at the outset careful to plan trials in such a way that you minimize potential sources of dilution and give the intervention the maximum opportunity to be tested with rigor and with a fair chance. I wonder if others have additional reaction.
Well, I'd chime in that one of the things that we're trying to do is restore some balance to the force, if you will. The RCT orthodoxy, a chunk of it anchored in easier problems. I would characterize the classic pill a day pharma trial as an easier problem than services intervention for the complex patient. And things that are done for convenience, frankly, in the simple model, like using intent to treat to bound the treatment effect, is something that's a little bit conservative in the original settings, but can be wildly conservative in the complex patient setting. And it might be a level of conservativeness that in general you can't afford. And then the retrial thing that Anna mentioned, since it doesn't happen very much, is not really something that we can count on. To a certain extent, what the distillation method does is it gives you the ability to combine a beta test and a formal trial, because it allows you to escape from the errors you made in establishing the eligibility criteria. A typical, more rigorous situation, you do a smaller, earlier trial to get the eligibility criteria right, and you wouldn't need to do the distillation method. You'd have basically done that with a beta trial of some sort. But since we generally can't afford it, our ability to put these two steps together and not have the failure of the baked-in beta trial automatically result in a declared failure of the ultimate trial, I think is where we hope to contribute.
And I'll just add a couple more things. First is the need for investment in the sort of pre-study, but before we get to an RCT, there's a great need to invest in quality improvement, research and development. So by the time you get to a point where you want to do an RCT of your intervention, you've already, you have a pretty good sense of implementation and what fidelity looks like, and the appropriate outcomes, ensuring that the outcomes that you're looking at match or are appropriate for your population and appropriate for your intervention. A lot of what we've been talking about at the coalition is the need to expand our measurement beyond single metrics, and so important. And then to Anna's point about design, evaluation design is so important. And I think just, more sort of, oversight's too bureaucratic of a word. I don't mean, bureaucratic oversight, but just really thoughtful design, taking into consideration that complex care programs are not, a pill a day sort of, problem to study. So.
Well, I think those are all really excellent and foundational points as we start to wrap this up. I think, unfortunately, we don't have time to answer any other questions today. Thank you all to submitted great questions. And I'll just note that really looking at the points that all of our speakers addressed, thinking about a more expansive understanding of measures, thinking about evaluation design. If you have questions or resources that you've created in these areas, please feel free to share them with us on the playbook. I'll invite my colleague, Emma Optoff, back on screen to wrap us up and talk about some next steps.
Great. Thank you so much, Logan. And thanks to Dawn, Chung, Anna, and John for their wonderful presentations and sharing their time and expertise with us. And to participants for sharing your insightful questions, and also to the 7 Foundation Collaborative for funding the playbook and the work that we do. So just wanted to emphasize that both the distillation method paper and the trial RCT paper from Camden Coalition are both summarized on the playbook. I put those links in the chat if you'd like to read those at a later time. And then the slides and the recording will be available within the next day or so. And we'd love for you to give us feedback on the evaluation survey, which will pop up after this, but I can drop the link in the chat as well. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. And please, if you have any resources that you'd like to share with us on the playbook, we'd be happy to chat with you about that. So thanks again and have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.